Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
Of all the enemies to public liberty, war is perhaps the most to be dreaded because it compromises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies. From those proceed debts and taxes. And armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Those words were written by James Madison in 1795, the father of the Constitution, the architect of the Bill of Rights, the man who understood better than perhaps anyone how republics preserve liberty and how they lose it. He continued, "No nation could preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare." Not might not preserve, not would find it difficult to preserve. No, could not. The relationship in Madison's view was categorical. Permanent war and free government were incompatible. And we have spent two series tracing how the American government grew beyond its constitutional boundaries. And from general welfare to the Great Society, we followed the transformation of enumerated powers into an administrative state. In the new Leviathan, we examined emergency governance from the Patriot Act to COVID lockdowns and the surveillance apparatus that now monitors American life. But there's a piece we have not yet examined, a piece that connects everything else: foreign policy. How did a republic founded on principles of non-intervention become an empire with military bases in 80 countries? How did a nation that warned against entangling alliances come to maintain alliance commitments that span the globe? And here's the question that matters most: how have these choices abroad shaped liberty here at home? This is the story we will tell. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions podcast. This is the introductory episode of Empire of Liberty, Americans' Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Part 3 of our 4-part historical series examining American constitutional, economic, and foreign policy history. This episode, this is a primer to this 20-part series in which we will explore how foreign policy connects to domestic liberty. Today, we will preview the journey ahead, and we will explain how you can follow along as we publish this series over the coming months. Let me begin by connecting what we have already learned to where we are going. In part 1, from general welfare to the Great Society, we traced how the Constitution's meaning transformed over 180 years. We watched as Madison's vision of enumerated powers gave way to Hamilton's vision of implied powers, and how that Hamiltonian interpretation became the foundation for the modern administrative state. We examined the New Deal revolution, the Great Society expansion, and the creation of a federal government that would be unrecognizable to the founders who drafted Article 1, Section 8. In part 2, the new Leviathan, we brought that story into the present. We examined how 9/11 birthed a surveillance state that monitors the communications of every American. We traced how the Federal Reserve's emergency powers had become permanent features of monetary policy. We analyzed how COVID-19 accelerated trends towards technocratic governance and how the merger of government and technology platforms has created new mechanisms of social control. We asked whether the infinite emergency has become the new normal. But here's what those two series did not fully address. Why did the executive branch accumulate so much power? Where did the national security state come from? Why does the United States maintain the largest military in human history? And why are we always at war? The answer lies in foreign policy, and foreign policy, in the founders' understanding, was not separate from domestic liberty. It was intimately connected. Return to Madison's warning. He did not merely say that war was unpleasant or expensive or tragic, though it is all of those things. He said that war was the most to be dreaded enemy of liberty because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. Let us trace his logic. War requires armies. Armies require money. Money requires taxes, or worse, debt. Taxes and debt transfer resources from citizens to government. They empower the few who control government at the expense of the many who fund it. But Madison went further. In war, he wrote, the discretion of the power of the executive is extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. There it is. War expands executive power. The commander-in-chief becomes the dominant figure in government. War multiplies patronage, military contracts, officer commissions, civilian positions in the war bureaucracy become tools of political influence. War seduces the minds of the people. Patriotic fervor suspends critical judgment and makes criticism appear disloyal. And war subdues the force of the people. Emergency measures become permanent. Liberties surrendered in crises are not returned when crises passes. Does this sound familiar? The imperial presidency we discussed in the new Leviathan, where did it come from? Foreign policy. The commander-in-chief powers that have grown to eclipse Congress's role in initiating hostilities. The surveillance state we traced from Stellar Wind to PRISM, what justified it? The war on terror. A war with no defined enemy, no territorial objective, no possible conclusion. The $38 trillion national debt, what drove it? Unfunded wars. Trillions spent in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yemen, with no debate, no declaration, no accountability. The concentration of power in the executive branch, what enabled that? Emergency authorities granted in wartime that were never revoked. Madison's prediction has been vindicated beyond anything he could have imagined. The surveillance apparatus, the military-industrial complex, the imperial presidency, the permanent debt. Those are not domestic developments that happen to have foreign policy components. They are the domestic consequences of foreign policy choices. This is why foreign policy matters for everyone who cares about liberty at home. You cannot understand the growth of government power without understanding the wars that justified it. You cannot understand the erosion of constitutional constraints without understanding the emergencies that suspended them. You cannot understand where we are without understanding how we got here. And that is the story this series will tell. Before we trace the departures from the founders' vision, we must first establish what that vision was. And on foreign policy, the founders spoke with remarkable clarity. George Washington, in his farewell address of 1796, arguably the most important foreign policy document in American history, laid out the principles that would guide American statecraft for over a century. The great rule of conduct for us in regard to foreign nations is in extending our commercial relations to have with them as little political connection as possible. Note the distinction Washington drew. Commercial relations, trade, were desirable. The more the better. But political connections, alliances, treaties that obligate action regardless of circumstance, were to be minimized. Washington continued, Europe has a set of primary interests, which to us have none, or a very remote relation. Hence, she must be engaged in frequent controversies, the causes of which are essentially foreign to our concerns. European powers fought over European questions, dynastic succession, colonial competition, balance of power. These were not American questions. American safety did not depend on which European dynasty sat on which European throne. American prosperity did not require that any particular European state prevail over its rivals. So Washington asked the question that still echoes. Why forego the advantages of so peculiar a situation? Why quit our own to stand upon foreign ground? Why, by interweaving our destiny with that of any part of Europe, entangle our peace and prosperity in the toils of European ambition, rivalship, interest, humor, or caprice? Geography was America's great blessing. 3,000 miles of ocean separated the new republic from European quarrels. No European power could invade or occupy the United States. Washington understood this was not a temporary advantage to be transcended, but a permanent blessing to be preserved. His conclusion: it is our true policy to steer clear of permanent alliances with any portion of the foreign world. Thomas Jefferson, in his first inaugural address of 1801, provided that formulation that would be quoted for generations. Peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations. Entangling alliances with none. Note the positive content. This was not hostility toward the world. It was not isolation. Jefferson was proposing that American engagement take specific forms: commercial, diplomatic, cultural, rather than military and political. And now, critics will say, and we will address this objection throughout the series, that Washington and Jefferson were speaking to a young, weak nation that could not project power. Their advice was prudent for 1796, but cannot govern a global superpower in the 21st century. But this objection misses the founders' argument entirely. They were not counseling restraint because America was weak. They were counseling restraint because foreign entanglements, regardless of the power of the entangled nation, require standing armies, accumulate debt, concentrate power in the executive, and corrupt Republican virtue. Now, these dynamics do not diminish as power increases, they intensify. The stronger the nation, the greater the temptation to intervene. The greater the intervention, the larger the military establishment required to sustain it. The larger the military, the more power flows to those who command it. Rome was not weak when it transformed from republic to empire. it was at the height of its power. The transformation occurred precisely because military success abroad created military commanders whose power exceeded civilian control. Washington knew this history. His warning was directed not at weakness, but at strength, at the temptations that strength creates and the corruption it enables. The founders embedded their foreign policy vision in the Constitution itself. Congress, the people's representatives, received the power to declare war, not the president. The decision for war was too consequential to be left for one man. Military appropriations were limited to 2 years, forcing regular renewal and preventing the entrenchment of a permanent military establishment. The preference for militia over standing armies reflected the understanding that citizens who fight for their own liberty are safer guardians than professionals who fight for pay. This was a coherent vision. It was not naivete born of weakness. It was wisdom born of understanding how republics preserve liberty and how they lose it. The questions this series will ask at every juncture is simple. What happened to that vision? When was it abandoned? Why? And what have been the consequences? Now, let me preview the journey ahead. Over 20 chapters and their corresponding podcast episodes, we will trace the transformation of American foreign policy from the Founders' Republic to the present empire. We will ask at each turning point, was the departure necessary? Did it serve American interests? What were the costs in blood, in treasure, in liberty, in constitutional fidelity? We begin where wisdom resided, the Founders' Republic. Chapters 1 and 2 will establish the baseline. Washington's farewell address, Jefferson's formulation, Madison's warning. And we will examine the early tests, the quasi-war with France, the Barbary Wars, the War of 1812. We will see how the founders navigated a dangerous world while preserving, imperfectly, but genuinely, their commitment to restraint. We will also examine continental expansion, manifest destiny, and ask honestly whether the seeds of empire were planted even before America looked beyond its shores. In part 2, the turn to empire, and chapters 3 through 5 trace the decisive turn. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marks the watershed. The moment America acquired overseas colonies, became an imperial power, and abandoned the founders' vision. We will examine the forces that drove this transformation: the yellow press, commercial interests, ideological crusading. We will follow the alliance systems and arms races that produced World War I, and then examine Woodrow Wilson's decision to intervene. A decision that shaped the 20th century and whose consequences we are still living with today. In part 3, the interwar period and World War II, in chapters 6 through 8, we'll examine the consequences of Wilson's war. The Sykes-Picot Agreement that drew borders of the modern Middle East, borders that have produced a century of conflict. The rise of the old right and the America First movement, the last sustained effort to preserve non-intervention before Pearl Harbor. And finally, World War II itself and its most enduring legacy, the permanent national security state. Part 4, the CIA and Covert Empire. Articles Chapters 9 through 12 enter the shadow world. The 1953 coup in Iran, which installed the Shah and produced the 1979 revolution and 45 years of hostility. The covert operations in Guatemala, Congo, Indonesia, Chile, each one producing blowback that would haunt American policy for decades. Vietnam, the war that demonstrated the limits of American power and should have taught lessons we have since forgotten. And Afghanistan in the 1980s, where we armed the Mujahideen, created the conditions for al-Qaeda, and set in motion the events that would culminate on September 11, 2001. And then part 5, the special relationships. Chapters 13 and 14 examine how foreign influence shapes American policy. The British special relationship and its role in drawing America into conflicts from World War I to Iraq. The Israel lobby, not as conspiracy theory, but as documented policy influence, and how it has shaped American engagement in the Middle East. We will ask throughout the essential question, Qui bono? Who benefits? Part 6, the Forever Wars. Chapters 15 through 17 bring us to the present catastrophe. Afghanistan redo, 20 years, trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, ending exactly where we began. Iraq, the war launched on false pretenses that empowered Iran, created ISIS, and destabilized an entire region. Libya, Syria, Yemen, the ongoing disasters that receive almost no public attention. And Ukraine, where the warnings of George Kennan and John Mearsheimer have been vindicated in the most tragic possible way. And then part 7, present and future. The final chapters examine the architecture of empire, the monetary system that enables it, the ongoing interventions that perpetuate it, and ask whether recovery is possible. Can we return to the founder's vision? What would that require? And what are the consequences if we do not? Throughout this journey, we will trace 5 thematic trends. First, the pattern of blowback. How interventions produce unintended consequences that become the justification for further intervention. The Mujahideen we armed became al-Qaeda. The Iraq War empowered Iran and created ISIS. The Libya intervention produced a failed state that destabilized North Africa. The pattern repeats because we do not learn. Second, the question of qui bono. Who benefits? Defense contractors? Foreign governments whose interest we serve? Think tanks funded by those who profit from war? Not the American people. Not the population of countries we claim to help. Third, media as propaganda. From the yellow press that drove the Spanish-American War to the embedded journalists who sold the Iraq War, the role of media in manufacturing consent for intervention. Fourth, the economics of empire. The military-industrial complex, the petrodollar system, the debt that finances permanent war. And fifth, the institutional ratchet. How emergency powers granted in wartime become permanent features of governance. How each intervention leaves a residue of expanded authority that is never relinquished. Now let me explain how this series will unfold and how you can follow along. Beginning on January 4th, We will publish on a consistent weekly rhythm and with 3 distinct content pieces. Each Sunday, a new article will appear on our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. These articles, 20 in total, will form the backbone of the series. They are substantial pieces. They have full citations and bibliographies. They can be read independently, but together they form a comprehensive narrative of the American foreign policy from 1789 to the present. Article 1, publishing on Sunday, January 4th, is entitled Entangling Alliances with None, the Founders' Vision of American Foreign Policy. It establishes the baseline we discussed today, Washington, Jefferson, Madison, and the principles they embedded in American statecraft. Article 2, publishing a week later on January 11th, examines manifest destiny, continental expansion, and the seeds of empire, and so on week by week through the entire arc. And then, each Saturday, 6 days after the article, we will release a podcast episode that explores the same themes in greater depth. These episodes will run approximately 40 minutes and will expand on the article's arguments. We'll include additional quotations from primary sources, address counter-arguments more fully, and provide the kind of context that audio allows but text sometimes constrains. So if you read Article 1 on Sunday, you can listen to the corresponding article the next Saturday. Third, each Tuesday, 9 days after the article, we will release a second podcast episode that connects the historical material to current events. These episodes, less formal, will examine contemporary policies, recent news, and ongoing debates through the lens of the article's themes. For example, after Article 1 on the Founders' Vision, the Tuesday episode will examine current alliances, current blowback, current repercussions that we're seeing in today's news. And we will always ask the founders questions: does this serve American interests? Does it preserve American liberty? This 3-part rhythm, Sunday article, Saturday deep dive, Tuesday contemporary application, will allow you to engage with the material whatever level suits your interest. Read the articles for the core argument, listen to the Saturday podcast for expanded analysis, and then listen to the Tuesday podcast to connect history to the present. And of course, I welcome your engagement. Comment on the articles, discuss the ideas on social media, challenge the arguments where you disagree. This is not a lecture to be passively received, but a conversation to be joined. We stand at a crossroads. The American Republic. This year we celebrate 250 years since the Declaration. And the American Republic was founded on principles of restraint, limited government, and non-intervention in the affairs of other nations. The founders understood that war concentrates power, that empires corrupt republics, and that liberty cannot survive perpetual conflict. For about a century and a quarter, half the amount of time that this country has been around, 120 some years since the Declaration of Independence, those principles guided American statecraft, imperfectly but genuinely. The United States traded with all nations. It maintained a small standing army. It avoided permanent alliances. It was not isolated from the world, but it was independent within it. The next 120 years proved that is no longer true. Today, now 250 years in, The United States maintains military bases in approximately 80 countries. It is bound by alliance commitments that could draw it into a war in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. It has been at war somewhere almost continuously since 1941. The national security state that emerged from these commitments monitors the communications of every American. The debt that finances these operations exceeds $38 trillion. The executive branch has accumulated powers the founders would have recognized as monarchical. The question this series will ask, the question that every American must answer eventually, is simple: republic or empire? The founders, in the first 125 years, chose republic. They designed institutions to preserve it. They warned against the forces that would destroy it. In the next 125 years, we have chosen differently. Or rather, choices have been made in our name, often without our knowledge, frequently without our consent. This series will trace those choices. It will document their consequences. It will give a fair hearing to those who defend them. And it will ask whether the founders' wisdom, dismissed as outdated, mocked as naive, might have served American interests better than the course we have taken. The question is not whether the founders' principles were right for their time. The question is whether we can recover from ours. That is the journey ahead. What will the next 125 years look like? I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been the introduction to the Empire of Liberty, American Foreign Policy's Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars, on the Consequential Actions podcast. Chapter 1, Entangling Alliances with None, the Founders' Vision of American Foreign Policy, will publish on Sunday, January 4th. It will publish on consequentialactions.com. The first podcast episode will follow on Saturday, January 10th. Also on consequentialactions.com or on YouTube at Consequential Actions Podcast. If you have enjoyed this introduction and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. The articles, the chapters are free. There you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the new Leviathan. To watch these podcasts as videos, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Actions Podcast for all podcast episodes, or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.